I made this video to try to simplify the bread baking process, so you can kind of forget all of the things you've heard or read about that you must do in order to get a perfect loaf of bread. And these techniques and this recipe, very easy to follow, lots of variation. The key to getting your bread to come out beautifully is having a good active starter. So if I gave you a starter, and really there's just a few steps you got to follow to get ready to bake. So take the starter I gave you, whether it's on the counter, on the fridge, you're going to discard all but about 100 grams of the starter, and then we're going to feed it with equal parts flour, equal parts water. Then we'll cover it up, we'll set it out on the counter, and it will be ripe and ready to bake somewhere between 4 to 6 hours. And I'll show you in the video how to determine its readiness. And then this recipe has a few steps, but basically there are just 4 phases. We're going to mix all the ingredients together, and then we're going to give it a bulk rise with some stretch and fold, and we're going to do this overnight. And then we'll take it out of the refrigerator the next day, give it its final rise, and that takes a couple hours, and then it'll take a good 2 hours to bake and cool. So the ideal timing of this recipe is to get started right about dinner time on day 1, and then if you get up early, your bread will be ready for a late breakfast the next day. And here's the detailed recipe with all the ingredients and the steps, and this is also included in the comments of the video for your reference. So we'll start with the whole wheat flour. As I said, I want about 15–20% of the volume or weight to be whole wheat. So I have that in the bowl first. And the whole wheat flour that I'm using, you can see it's a 14% protein content that helps with the gluten structure. But most of the flours you'll see will be around that area. And then the bread flour I'm using is also a high gluten content. It has about 14.5%. So here you go, whether you're using a scale or your volumetric measurement, let's put the whole wheat flour in first, and then we'll get to the total volume, in my case, 1,000 grams of the bread flour. So just add that in right on top of the whole wheat flour until we get to our total weight. And now we're going to add the water and mix that up for the autolyse portion. So what I like to do is sort of dig a little hole in the middle here that lets the water deep in and penetrate a little faster. And we'll add in the water just little by little, bringing it together with, in my case, a bench scraper. But you can also use a spoon. And I like to get it primarily mixed up with the scraper, and then I'll just switch and work it in with my hands. So just continue to move the flour and water around. Again, we're not being too aggressive here. You're just bringing the ingredients together. And the goal here is to form just a shaggy ball. So continue to mix that, kind of working it from the bottom around the sides to try to get that loose dough all wet and all in one big mass. So you'll see now, punching it with your hands. I reserve a little bit of the water so that you can sort of gauge the consistency. And you'll kind of get a feel for this, but this should be a pretty sticky dough. So this is what it finally looks like after we brought it all together. We call the shaggy mess. It'll stick to your fingers for sure, but that's just about the right consistency. And now we're going to wait to add our starter. We're going to let the flour absorb the water some, but this starter is ready. You can see by the bubbles, it smells nice and sour. What we're going to do is a little float test just to make sure that's ready. And the float test is just taking a pea-sized drop of your starter and gently drop it on some water and make sure that it floats. That indicates that there's enough gas or air in the starter to be really active. So you'll see, just let it float there. That indicates that it's ready. If it's not, you may need to either give it a little bit more time or give it another feed. So at this point, we're just going to let it rest for anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour. Just cover it, put it in a dry place, and we'll be ready for the next step. Now we are ready to add the starter and the salt. And the salt I'm using is, got it measured here, 20 grams of salt. I'm using a sea salt. I recommend do not use an iodized salt that inhibits the growth of the yeast. So any sea salt will do. And then our active starter. Now you can add the active starter in the previous step, and I might suggest that it makes it a little easier to gauge the moisture or the wetness of the dough. So you can either do that before or after the autolays. I'm doing it here, and you don't have to be too scientific about the measurement, but I'm doling out about 250 grams to mix into the flour and the water. And of course, we're always going to want to leave a little bit of the starter to feed and continue the growth. So we'll cover that in a minute, but you'll see I left just a little bit there. Now we're ready to mix that in, and you're going to mix that in by hand and always gauging the moisture here, because this is really your last chance to add any water or flour if it's too wet. So I add the salt intermittently, don't do it all at once. That lets you distribute it a little bit more evenly. So just kind of mix a little bit, add a little bit more salt, and keep mixing that in with your hands. Get that starter well distributed in among the dough. And you just kind of bring that together from the bottom, punch it down, add the rest of your salt. And as I said, keep gauging that consistency. This is about the wetness we want, nice and sticky, kind of movable. So now we're back to feeding the starter, and as I said, we've left a little bit in there. The amount that you leave is not that important. I like to start with about anywhere from 2 tablespoons to a half a cup, or if you're doing it by weight, that's about 20 grams up to 50 grams. So what you're going to do is you're always just going to add an equal weight of or volume of flour and an equal weight of water. So in my case, I'm adding about 40 grams or 80 grams of flour, and then I'll do 80 grams of water. Now remember, the weight and the volume of waters are different. If you're doing 80 grams of water, it's also 80 milliliters, but water basically weighs twice as much as flour. Now I use a distilled water here. You need to use distilled or filtered water. If you use water from the tap, it's got chlorine in it, which inhibits the growth of the bacteria. So just add in that equal weight of water, and then we're going to mix it up. And you can double check the consistency here. Again, the measurements don't have to be too exact here. Just judge the consistency. You want a nice thick paste. I always say use it, get to about the consistency of peanut butter. Make sure you mix that all in really good. There should be no lumps in it. You can add a little bit more water if you want, or a little bit more flour that you want. And we're just going to mix that up, get that right, and either put that back into the refrigerator or on the counter. So let's demonstrate our stretch and fold technique. This is our dough that has risen about just about an hour, and you're going to grab an edge of your dough with your wet hand so it doesn't stick, and keep it wet, keep your fingers wet there. Grab the dough by a corner, kind of gently stretch it out and fold it over on itself. And what this is doing is helping build the gluten structure. You know, be gentle here not to tear the dough, but just rotate it around. I probably fold it over 4 or 5 times for each stretching session, and then leave it in a nice little ball, cover it up, and you'll let it rise again for another 1 to 2 hour period. So here we are in our next period, and the dough has risen a little bit more. It's got a little bit more body to it. It should be able to stretch a little farther. So what I suggest you do, and again, this is optional, but is I do 2 stretch and fold sessions, generally 1 or 2 hours apart, before I put it into the refrigerator for the bulk rise. So as you see here, the dough's getting bigger, getting stronger, building up some gas into the dough. And you don't have, there's no really exact science here. Just be gentle stretch it out, fold it over. And, as I said in the optionality, you do not have to do this. I mean, you can just cover it up and put it in the refrigerator overnight or let it bulk rise for 4 hours. But this is about what I like it to look like before I pop it into the fridge. So just cover it up with some plastic. You can put the towel on top for a little extra coverage. And then if you're going to do more than about a 6 or 8 hour rise, I suggest putting it in the refrigerator. That'll slow down the rise a little bit. But you can also just leave this out on the counter for the bulk rise and let it sit there for about 8 hours. Okay, and now I'm done with the bulk rise. You can pull this out of the refrigerator in my case, or if you let it rise over just outside, that's fine. We're going to put that on the counter, give it just a little bench rest, about a 20-minute bench rest before our final proofing. So flour your work surface. That's going to keep it from sticking. And always treat this dough very gently. So this has about doubled in size. It's got a lot of good gas in it. We don't want to deflate that at this point. So you'll see I'm kind of gently removing it from the bowl, sort of easing it out with a soft, either a soft spatula or some kind of tool. And then what we're going to do is stretch this out to a nice rectangle and let it rest. So you'll see there kind of the big round mass as it comes out of the bowl. Flour up your hands so you can work with this. And you're just going to kind of want to stretch this out into a long rectangle so you can perform a couple of envelope folds before you let it rest. So just take one edge, fold it into the middle, take the other edge, stretch it out a little, and fold it in. And that stretching out, again, is building a little bit of tension. Now our dough has a lot of strength or structure to it, so it won't tear at this point, but again, be gentle. I'll give it one more fold in and of itself, and then we'll flip it over and just let that rest for anywhere from 10, 15, 20 minutes. Okay, and now for the proofing phase, we're going to let our dough rise in our proofing baskets. Now here what I have is really the finished product. So this is an already shaped pool of dough, and I'm going to put it into my proofing basket. And what I'm using here is a Banneton. This is kind of a fancy tool. The Banneton is made with rattan, which helps absorb the moisture, and you can use that basket with or without this linen liner. I'm going to go ahead and use the linen liner, and really it's just choice here. Without the liner, it gives your bread a little bit more shape. You got to make sure that liner is well floured, and we're just going to pick up the dough very gently and plop it into the basket without changing the shape. Now, once it's in there, you got to put a little flour around the edges because this is going to rise, and some parts that aren't touching the linen cover now will be touching them at the end of the proof. So just kind of apply that around. And you'll see this is the bottom of the loaf of bread, so that's a little bit rough. You want to put a little bit of flour on that also. So we're going to set that aside and let that rest for the final proof. But before we do that, let me show you how we got to this part. So this is our dough, which has just come out of our bowl after our bulk rise, and we're going to shape this into that little ball. So here I don't want a floured surface. I actually want to use the tension of the dough sticking to the surface. You do need to flour your hands. But what I'm going to do is just, as you see, plop that out onto the work surface. And then I'm just going to fold it over nice and gently to form this ball. So you should have a general rectangular structure. And you can spread that out a little bit if you need to. But as I said, you got to be very gentle here not to destroy all that good gas bubbles. Just kind of just work that out into a nice rectangle. Fold it over a couple of times till you get to, we call that the envelope fold. flip it over, and as I said, now I'm going to kind of pull it together to close that crease on the bottom. Got to make sure your hands are well floured here because it's constantly going to be sticking to the dough. But what you do is just kind of move that ball towards you little by little. And what you're really doing is you're, as I said, closing that little seal on the bottom, but you're also tightening this up a little bit. See, remember that's a little rough there still. But as I keep pulling, I'm really closing that. And what I'm also doing here is I'm building tension on the top of it. So that's just creating a little tighter ball. You'll probably start to see some of your gas bubbles kind of pop up to the surface, but just keep working that around till it's a nice tight little ball. And you'll see now some of those little bubbles you might want to pop and work that into a perfect shape, set it aside. So this is where we were before we put it into the banneton, and I'm just going to demonstrate that you don't have to have this fancy banneton, just a regular Pyrex dish will work. If you want to use a Pyrex dish, of course, you got to create your own liner. So in this case, just use a regular dish towel. Of course, apply a liberal amount of flour to keep it from sticking to the dish towel, and really work that flour into the fabric. And then plop it in, cover it up, and then we're going to leave that for its final proof. And this final proof can be anywhere from 2 to 3 or 4 hours out on the counter. And now our bread has done its final proof. You'll see it's about doubled in size. And another test you can do to make sure that's ready is what I call sort of the bounce back test. Just press in the dough there, watch it should come back to its shape. And that means it's got a good bit of gas in there and a good bit of tension. So now at this point, we're going to want to turn this over onto a piece of parchment paper before we put it into our Dutch oven. And if you don't have parchment paper, you can just use tin foil with a little bit of spray oil on it. But just gently ease that out of the banneton. And if you have properly floured your linen or your proofing basket, that'll come right out. And then the next step is going to be, what we want to do is just, we're going to brush off a little bit of that extra flour you see there. And you can just use any brush here. And again, this is just purely for cosmetics. But I like to remove that from the dough before I pop that into the oven. There we go, get that nice and clean. And now the last step is to score the bread. And I'm using here what's called a baker's lamb, just a fancy word for a razor blade and a wooden handle. And you're going to want to score this to let the air expand out of the bread. Otherwise, it's just going to burst a seam somewhere. So there's no real science here. I like to cut in about anywhere from 1/4 to 1/2 inch. And you can pick your pattern. You just got to use kind of a quick, steady motion here. So we're just going to do a couple scores, couple vertical, couple horizontal, kind of a cross-hatch pattern. And if you don't have the baker's lamb, of course, you can just use a sharp serrated knife for this. But you'll see that's going to open up a little bit before we put it into the Dutch oven. So now my Dutch oven, it's been preheating in the oven, so it is hot. You have to be careful how you handle it. But you're just going to want to lower that loaf in without misshaping it any. And a little trick here is to leave a little extra on the side so you don't burn your fingers when you set this in. Just move back the paper, and I like to trim it a little bit just to keep it from not changing the round shape of the dough. So there we go. Put the top back on, and it's ready to pop in the oven. So your oven should be preheated to 450 degrees, and we're going to cook it for 20 minutes with the cover on, and then we're going to take the top of the Dutch oven off and cook it for an additional 30 minutes. So now our loaves are out of the oven, and you'll see why we did that slicing. Lets those things really open up, and it's got a good rise on it. That's what's referred to as the oven spring. Got a good hollow sound to it. A little burn on the bottom, and you can avoid that sometimes by putting a little coarse cornmeal in the bottom of the Dutch oven. That lifts the bread up off the bottom of the metal, lets the air flow underneath it a little bit. Here's one we've opened up, so you see you got a good crumb, nice big aerated holes there, and you know, like a good dark thick crust. So the only tip here I would say is once you take it out of the oven, let it cool for at least an hour before slicing it open.